could say I've seen my fair share of strange things out on the road, but nothing prepared me for the events of that night. A night that forever changed my view of the world. In the 20 years I've been a truck driver, come across a lot. Unexplained lights flickering in the distance, odd shadows flitting across the highway, odd hours, but it was nothing compared to what happened on that fog-shrouded road. The open highway stretches out before you, like a long, winding ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the unknown. It's just you, the hum of the engine, and the seemingly endless stretch of road. The solitude is both comforting and unsettling, a reminder that while you're in control of this steel behemoth, the world around you is vast and unpredictable. I've always taken pride in my job, freedom it offers, and the ability to see the country in a way few people do. But there's a darker side to it as well. The late-night drives through desolate stretches of highway can wear on you, playing tricks on your mind. The shadows seem to grow longer, darker, and you start to wonder if you're truly alone out there. The stories I've heard from fellow truckers often linger in the back of my mind. Tales of supernatural encounters and dangerous ambushes on lonely roads. Some of them sounded ridiculous, kind of campfire stories you'd expect to hear at a sleepover, but others were unsettlingly believable. I often found myself brushing them off with a chuckle, confident that my years on the road had prepared me for anything. There's something about the night that changes everything. The darkness cloaks the familiar in mystery and turns the mundane into the sinister. It was on such a night as the fog hung heavy like a shroud, and the trees stood like silent sentinels along the roadside, that I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew. The night started like any other. I was hauling a load across state lines, the rhythmic thrum of the tires on the pavement providing a comforting backdrop to my thought. As the miles slipped by, my mind wandered, lost in the monotony of the drive. The world outside my cab was reduced to the soft glow of the dashboard lights and the beam of the headlights slicing through the fog. There was a certain peace to it all, a sense of detachment from the world. I was a ghost in a machine, hurtling through the night with nothing but the stars to keep me company. But beneath that calm surface, a sense of unease had begun to creep in. A nagging feeling that something was watching, waiting. I shook off the feeling, attributing it to the late hour and the tricks fatigue could play on the mind. But as I navigated the twisting turns of the unfamiliar road, the sensation grew stronger, gnawing at the edges of my awareness. It was as if the fog itself had taken on a life of its own, swirling with a malevolent intent that I couldn't quite shake. As the road unfurled before me, winding its way through the dense forest, I spotted something ahead. A shape standing on the shoulder, barely visible in the swirling mist. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was a person, or at least the outline of one, standing still and silent in the night. The sight was jarring, an intrusion of humanity in an otherwise desolate landscape. My heart skipped a beat as I debated what to do. The figure stood motionless, save for a flickering light that seemed to beckon me closer. Despite the warnings and stories that flooded my mind, I felt a pull, an inexplicable urge to stop. This was the moment where every horror story I've ever heard screamed at me, keep driving, to ignore the shadowy figure and continue on my way. Yet something inside me, a combination of curiosity and concern, made me hesitate. I slowed the truck, my headlights illuminating the scene before me. As I did, the fog parted just enough to reveal the face of the person standing there. It was a woman, her features shrouded in shadow, her eyes hidden beneath a tangle of hair. She held a flashlight, its beam flickering weakly as if struggling against the encroaching darkness. My mind raced with possibilities. Was she in trouble? Had her car broken down? Or was this the prelude to something far more sinister? The stories of highway bandits and ambushes flashed through my mind, a cacophony of warnings that I couldn't ignore. But I didn't want to abandon her. The sight of her standing there, so small and vulnerable against the vast emptiness of the night, tugged at something deep within me. Against my better judgment, I brought the truck to a stop a few yards ahead of her, my heart pounding in my chest as I prepared to step out into the unknown. It was a decision that would haunt me forever, a choice that would lead me down a path of terror and despair. As I opened the door and felt the cold night air rush in, I knew there was no turning back. Whatever lay ahead, I was about to come face to face with a nightmare beyond anything I had ever imagined. Stepping out of the cab felt like crossing a threshold into another world, where the familiar comforts of the truck were replaced by the oppressive weight of the unknown. Chill in the air was sharp and biting, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else. Something I couldn't quite place, yet seemed faintly metallic and unsettling. The road was eerily silent, the only sound the low rumble of the idling engine behind me. As I moved cautiously toward the woman, my boots crunching on the gravel, I felt an inexplicable sense of being watched. The trees on either side of the road loomed like dark sentinels, their twisted branches clawing at the sky, as if trying to escape the confines of the earth. I called out to her, my voice barely cutting through the fog. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The question lingered in the air, echoing back at me as though the forest itself was mocking my attempt at bravery. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood there, swaying slightly, her gaze locked on something unseen in the distance. Her flashlight flickered again, casting erratic shadows that danced across her face, momentarily revealing her expression. One of fear and something else, something like desperation. "Please, I need help," she finally spoke, her voice a fragile whisper carried away by the wind. It was enough to send a shiver down my spine, a reminder that I was alone out here with nothing but the dark, foreboding night as my companion. Part of me screamed to get back in the truck and drive away, to leave this strange encounter behind and never look back. But another part that had stopped in the first place, urged me forward. I couldn't just leave her there, not when she seemed so lost and afraid. As I got closer, the fog thickened, wrapping around us like a living thing. It was then I noticed something off about the scene, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The light from her flashlight illuminated the ground, revealing a set of tire tracks that led off the road and disappeared into the woods. They were fresh, the mud still glistening from a recent rain. "What happened?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though my heart was hammering in my chest. "Did your car break down?" She hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the trees before she answered. "I was traveling with my brother. We hit something big. It came out of nowhere." Her words were clipped, tinged with a panic that was barely contained beneath the surface. A chill crawled down my spine. The road was empty, and there was no sign of another vehicle or anyone else around. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was in genuine distress. "Where's your brother now?" I asked, glancing nervously toward the woods. The darkness beyond the edge of the road was impenetrable, a wall of black that seemed to swallow all light and sound. "He went to get help. He said he'd be right back," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. Her gaze shifted back to the road as if expecting him to appear at any moment. Every fiber of my being told me something was off. The entire situation felt wrong, like a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit together. But the fog clouded not only the night, but my judgment as well, leaving me teetering on the brink of decision. "I have a phone in the truck," I offered, trying to sound reassuring. "Maybe we can call for help?" She nodded, a flicker of relief crossing her face. "Yes, please. I don't know how long he'll be." I turned back toward the truck, my mind racing with possibilities. As I reached for the cab's door, a sound caught my attention. A soft rustle, barely audible, but distinct enough to make me pause. I scanned the trees, the shadows shifting and twisting as if alive, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Shaking off the unease, I climbed back into the cab and retrieved my phone. The display was dim, battery dangerously low, but it was enough to make a call. I held it out to her, hoping to ease her worry, but her gaze was fixed on something behind me, her eyes wide with growing alarm. Before I could turn, a loud thud reverberated through the truck, followed by the sound of something, or someone, scraping along the metal. My heart skipped a beat, and instinct took over. I whirled around, adrenaline surging through my veins, ready to confront whatever threat had emerged from the shadows. The night was now alive with sound, the once quiet road filled with a cacophony of rustling leaves and snapping twigs. It was as if the entire forest had awakened, its unseen inhabitants moving with a purpose that sent chills racing down my spine. I reached for the flashlight, its beam cutting through the fog like a knife. My mind raced with question. Was this a setup? An ambush? Stories of highway bandits and desperate criminals replayed in my head, each scenario more terrifying than the last. And then I saw them, figures emerging from the shadows, their movements deliberate and menacing. There were at least 3, maybe more, their faces obscured by masks that glinted in the flashlight's beam. My pulse quickened, primal fear taking hold as I realized the danger I was in. The woman's distress, the eerie stillness of the road, the tracks leading into the woods, it all made sense now. I had walked straight into a trap, carefully orchestrated plan designed to ensnare unsuspecting travelers like me. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't let it take control. I had to think, to act fast if I wanted any chance of escape. With my heart pounding like a drum, I made a split-second decision, one that would determine whether I lived to tell this tale or became another cautionary story among truckers. I reached for the door, the weight of the situation crashing down on me like a tidal wave. There was no room for hesitation now, no time to second-guess the choice I was about to make. I had to trust my instincts and hoped they would guide me safely through the chaos that awaited. As I braced myself for what was to come, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Prelude to a night filled with unimaginable horrors and challenges that would test the limits of my courage and resolve. In that moment, as the fog swirled around me and the shadows closed in, I realized the true meaning of fear. It wasn't just the danger lurking in the dark. It was the realization that sometimes the worst monsters are not those we conjure in our nightmares, but the ones we encounter in the waking world, hidden beneath the veneer of everyday life. As I stared at the masked figures emerging from the shadows, a cold wave of realization washed over me. This was no ordinary highway encounter. It was an ambush, crafted with sinister precision. The air seemed to hum with tension, each breath I took feeling thick and suffocating, like I was inhaling the very fog that encircled us. The woman stood rooted in place, her eyes now filled with something beyond fear. Trail. It was as if she had led me here, perhaps unknowingly, into this pit of vipers. Her earlier desperation had transformed into a mute apology, gaze flicking between me and the advancing figures. But there was no time to dwell on regrets or what-ifs. Survival was now my sole focus. "Get back in the truck," I shouted, though my voice sounded weak, barely piercing the heavy atmosphere. My heart hammered against my ribcage, each beat echoing the primal urge to flee. But my instincts screamed at me to stay vigilant, to not make any sudden movements that might provoke the intruders. Figures continued their approach, their intentions clear and malicious. I could make out their shapes now, broad-shouldered and imposing, the predatory grace that sent shivers crawling up my spine. They were close enough for me to see the glint of metal in their hands, weapons ready to strike. My mind raced, grappling with the grim reality that these people wanted more than just my cargo. They wanted control, dominance over my fate. I felt the woman's hand on my arm, a silent plea for guidance. Her touch was cold, trembling, and in that brief moment of connection, I understood the depth of her terror. Whatever circumstances had led her here, she was as much a pawn in this twisted game as I was. With every ounce of strength, I steeled myself, assessing the situation with a clarity I hadn't known I possessed. The truck was my sanctuary, my fortress against the encroaching threat. If I could reach it, perhaps I could regain the upper hand. My mind churned through the possibilities, a desperate gamble against the odds stacked against me. The leader of the group stepped forward, his mask a grotesque caricature that concealed any hint of humanity. He brandished a crowbar, the metal gleaming ominously in the dim light. I could feel the weight of his gaze, an invisible pressure that threatened to crush the courage I was struggling to muster. "Hand over your keys," he demanded, his voice low and gravelly, like rocks grinding together in a forgotten pit. It was a command devoid of empathy, predatory growl that left no room for negotiation. My fingers tightened around the key in my pocket, the small piece of metal suddenly feeling like a lifeline, fragile thread connecting me to the sliver of hope that still lingered in the recesses of my mind. I met his gaze, my resolve hardening into something unyielding. "Back off," I replied, my voice steady despite the fear coiling around my insides. It was a challenge, a refusal to submit to the darkness that threatened to swallow me whole. The leader chuckled, a sound that dripped with disdain and amusement. "Brave words for a man standing alone in the dark. You think you can take us all on?" His words cut through the air, taunt that echoed with malicious intent. The other figures shifted, their presence a suffocating reminder of the precariousness of my situation. The fog seemed to close in around us, claustrophobic cloak that whispered of hidden dangers lurking just beyond the edges of perception. I knew I was outnumbered, but the truck held power. Size, its strength, and the engine idling with latent potential were my allies in this perilous dance. But I needed a plan, a way to break free from the tightening grip of fear, threatened to paralyze me. The woman clung to my side, her grip a lifeline as much as it was a burden. She was a reminder of the stakes, the fragile line between courage and folly. I couldn't leave her to face these predators alone, couldn't abandon her to the mercy of their malice. My eyes darted to the truck, calculating the distance and the obstacles between us and safety. The night stretched out before me, an expanse of uncertainty that seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to fight, to do anything but stand here like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming disaster. The leader took another step forward, his men following suit, and I felt time slow to a crawl. Each heartbeat was a countdown, a relentless reminder that the window for action was rapidly closing. It was then that I made my move. Calculated risk, fueled by desperation and the primal will to survive. I grabbed the woman's hand, pulling her along as I sprinted toward the truck. The ground beneath us seemed to pulse with energy, each step a defiance of the fear that clung like a shadow. The intruders reacted, shouts and curses filling the air as they surged after us. But I was faster, driven by a need that transcended logic, a need to escape, protect, to defy the darkness that sought to claim us. We reached the truck, the cab looming like a beacon of hope amidst the encroaching nightmare. I shoved the woman inside, slamming the door shut behind us as the figures closed in. The engine roared to life with a shuddering growl, a sound that reverberated through my bones like the battle cry of a beast unleashed. Adrenaline surged through my veins, a heady rush that fueled my every action. The leader and his cohorts were almost upon us, their faces twisted with frustration and rage. But I had the advantage now. The truck's formidable bulk between us and the malevolent force sought to ensnare us. I jammed the gear shift into drive, the tires spinning with a screech of protest as the truck lurched forward. The figures fell back, their momentum halted by the sheer force of the machine I commanded. The fog parted before us, a veil torn asunder by the defiance of our escape. As we barreled down the road, the night raced by in a blur of shadow and light, chaotic tapestry that mirrored the turmoil within me. The woman clung to the seat, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and relief. I could feel her presence beside me, a fragile reminder of the humanity we both clung to amidst the terror threatened to consume us. The road stretched on, an endless ribbon of possibility that beckoned us to safety. But I knew better than to let my guard down. The night was far from over, and the shadows that lurked behind us were more than mere figments of imagination. They were real, tangible, and relentless. With each passing mile, the truck seemed to absorb the fear that coursed through my veins, transforming it into a determination that bordered on the edge of recklessness. The night was alive with the echoes of pursuit, the distant cries of those who sought to reclaim what they believed was theirs. But I wouldn't let them win. Not tonight, not ever. As long as there was breath in my lungs and fire in my heart, I would fight against the darkness that threatened to close in around us. The road was my ally, a silent companion that whispered of freedom and the promise of dawn. And so, we drove on into the unknown, leaving behind the shattered remains of a nightmare that would haunt my every waking moment. A reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't those we find in the shadows, the ones that walk among us, hidden beneath masks, deceit, and treachery. As the truck roared down the lonely highway, I struggled to keep my focus on the road ahead. My mind was a storm of thoughts and fears. each one battling for dominance as I tried to make sense of the chaos I had just escaped. The woman beside me remained silent, her presence a stark reminder of the horror we had narrowly avoided. The night stretched before us like an endless abyss, the headlights slicing through the darkness with a cold, unwavering light. The trees flanked us like ominous sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky as if seeking to pull it down and smother us beneath their weight. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched, that the forest itself held secrets it was unwilling to relinquish. I stole a glance at the woman, her face a mask of tension and fatigue. She was clutching her arms tightly, as if trying to hold herself together, her gaze fixed on the road, as if it was the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. The silence between us was heavy, thick, oppressive thing that seemed to grow with each passing mile. Finally, I broke the quiet, my voice rough and raw from the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. "Are you okay?" The question felt hollow, almost absurd given the circumstances, but it was all I could manage. I needed some semblance of normalcy, some fragile thread of human connection to cling to in the wake of the terror we had faced. She turned to me, her eyes haunted by shadows that seemed to dance just beyond the edges of comprehension. "I think so," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I thought he was going to help." Her words were a fractured confession, a glimpse into the labyrinth of guilt and confusion that swirled within her. I wanted to reassure her, to tell her that it wasn't her fault, but the words felt hollow, impotent against the enormity of what we had endured. The road unfurled before us, a winding serpent that twisted through the wilderness, each curve a new trial for my frayed nerves. My hands were clenched around the wheel, the tension radiating through my body like a live wire. The dashboard lights cast an eerie glow across the cab, illuminating the sweat that beaded on my forehead like a macabre halo. "Where are we going?" she asked, breaking the silence that had once again settled between us like a shroud. I hesitated, unsure of the answer myself. The open road held a certain allure, promise of escape from the nightmares that pursued us. But the reality of our situation was inescapable. We couldn't drive forever, couldn't outrun the shadows that clung to us with tenacious persistence. "Anywhere but here," I replied finally, my voice tinged with a desperation I couldn't quite hide. The words felt flimsy, like a fragile shield against the encroaching darkness that threatened to engulf us. The night seemed to close in around us, fog thickening with a malevolent intent set my teeth on edge. It was as if the world itself was conspiring to keep us trapped in this waking nightmare, to deny us the sanctuary of dawn and deliverance. My thoughts drifted to the figures we had left behind, their presence a lingering specter that haunted the periphery of my mind. I couldn't shake the image of their masked faces, the glint of metal in their hands, and the sinister intent that had driven them to such depravity. "They won't stop, you know," the woman said suddenly, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "They never do." Her words hung in the air, a grim prophecy that settled into the pit of my stomach, a leaden weight. I wanted to dismiss her fears as paranoia, to reassure her that we were safe now. The truth gnawed at me, undeniable in its stark clarity. Truck barreled forward, the engine's growl a constant companion in the oppressive silence that followed her statement. Each passing mile felt like a temporary reprieve, fragile truce with the forces that pursued us through the shadows of the night. I knew we couldn't keep running forever. Sooner or later, we would have to confront the reality of our situation, to find a way to end the nightmare that had ensnared us. But for now, the road was our only refuge, a tenuous lifeline that stretched out before us, promising freedom even as it threatened to lead us deeper into the heart of the unknown. The woman shifted beside me, her movements a restless echo of the turmoil churned within us both. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice tinged with a sorrow that cut through the air like a whispered lament. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was just trying to get home." Her confession stirred something within me, a flicker of empathy that had been buried beneath layers of fear and suspicion. In that moment, I saw her not as a catalyst for our current predicament, but as a fellow traveler caught in the web of fate, struggling against the same darkness that sought to consume us both. "It's not your fault," I replied, my words barely audible over the rumble of the engine. "None of this is your fault." The road stretched on, an unyielding ribbon of uncertainty that wound through the night like a sinister serpent. Each mile brought us closer to an unknown destination, a place where we might finally find respite from the horrors that pursued us. But deep down, I knew the truth. The road was not a haven, but a crucible. It was a test of our endurance, our resolve, and our willingness to confront the nightmares that lurked in the shadows. And as long as we remained on this path, there would be no escape from the darkness, followed us with relentless determination. The woman's presence beside me was a reminder of that truth, a living testament to the fragile alliance we had forged in the face of unimaginable terror. Together, we would navigate the treacherous terrain of our shared fate, bound by the tenuous hope that somewhere beyond the horizon lay the promise of dawn and the end of our ordeal. The night wore on, an endless tapestry of shadow and light, painted the world in shades of foreboding mystery. The road twisted and turned beneath us, a winding serpent that led us ever deeper into the heart of the unknown. And as we drove on, the weight of the world pressing down upon us like a suffocating shroud, I couldn't shake the feeling that our journey was far from over, that the true horror awaited us in the shadows that loomed just beyond the reach of the headlight. The road stretched endlessly before us, a dark ribbon winding through the forest like the spine of some ancient beast. The night wrapped around us like a cloak, the fog clinging to the truck's windows, obscuring the world outside and reducing it to a blur of shadow and light. The hum of the engine was our only companion, a monotonous lullaby that seemed to echo in the hollow silence of the night. Beside me, the woman sat in quiet contemplation, her eyes lost in the murky depths of the passing trees. Her presence was a reminder of our shared plight, a tangible link to the reality that had ensnared us. Yet, despite the bond forged in the crucible of fear, an unspoken tension lingered between us, a specter that refused to be dispelled by the relative safety of the truck's interior. The road began to narrow, trees encroaching on either side like silent sentinels watching our every move. Their branches stretched toward the sky, gnarled fingers clawing at the darkness as if seeking to tear away the very fabric of night itself. The oppressive weight of their gaze pressed down on us, constant reminder that we were not alone in this labyrinthine wilderness. I felt the familiar twinge of unease, a primal instinct honed by years of navigating treacherous roads and unforgiving landscape. The sense of being watched, hunted by unseen eyes that lurked just beyond the periphery of my vision, gnawed at me like a persistent itch I couldn't quite reach. "We should have turned back," the woman whispered, her voice a fragile thread barely audible over the rumble of the engine. Her words hung in the air, echoing the doubts that had plagued me since we first fled into the night. "Turning back isn't an option," I replied, my tone firmer than I felt. The path behind us was a broken promise, littered with danger and betrayal. The only way was forward, deeper into the heart of the unknown, even as the shadows seemed to close in around us, an ever-tightening noose of uncertainty. The trees closed ranks, their trunks looming like monoliths, casting long, skeletal shadows that danced across the road in a macabre ballet. Each twist and turn seemed to draw us further from the world of light and safety, deeper into the embrace of a primeval forest that seemed to pulse with a life all its own. The woman shifted in her seat, her unease palpable, a mirror of the tension that crackled between us. "What if they're still following us?" she asked, a voice laced with fear and an undercurrent of desperation. I hesitated, unwilling to give voice to the possibility that had haunted me since our escape. The thought that the masked figures might still be trailing us, hidden among the shadows, was a chilling prospect. Yet, as much as I wanted to dismiss her fears, the truth was that we were alone in a world of darkness, our fate hanging by the slenderest of threads. "They won't catch us," I reassured her, though the conviction in my words felt as insubstantial as the fog that surrounded us. We're miles ahead, and the truck's faster than anything they could throw at us. But even as I spoke, doubt gnawed at me like a worm burrowing into the heart of an apple. The night was vast and unyielding, a labyrinth that promised both salvation and ruin. And somewhere in its depths lurked the predators who had set their sights on us, driven by a relentless hunger that could not be satiated. The road twisted and turned, an unyielding serpent that defied logic and reason. Each bend was a leap of faith, a blind plunge into the unknown that left my heart pounding in my chest like a caged animal. The forest pressed in on us from all sides, a living entity that seemed to breathe with malevolent intent. Breath, a whispering rustle that echoed through the trees like the murmurs of forgotten souls. I tightened my grip on the wheel, my knuckles white against the worn leather as I fought to maintain control over the unwieldy beast was the truck. The path was narrow, barely wide enough to accommodate its bulk, and the slightest misstep could send us careening into the waiting embrace of the forest. As we navigated yet another hairpin turn, the fog seemed to thicken, wrapping itself around us like a shroud. The headlights struggled to penetrate its suffocating embrace, reducing our visibility to mere feet ahead. I squinted into the gloom, my senses straining to pick up any sign of danger lurking in the shadows. The woman's breathing quickened, a soft, ragged sound that punctuated the silence between us. She leaned forward, her eyes locked on the road with an intensity that spoke of both fear and determination. Her fingers drummed a nervous rhythm on her knee, a silent mantra against the encroaching dread that threatened to overwhelm us both. And then, without warning, the world seemed to shift, reality twisting into something unrecognizable. The truck lurched violently, skidding across the slick pavement as if it had been caught in the grip of an unseen force. My heart leaped into my throat, adrenaline flooding my veins as I fought to keep the vehicle from spinning out of control. The road had vanished beneath us, replaced by a yawning chasm that loomed just ahead, a gaping maw ready to swallow us whole. My instincts screamed at me to slam on the brakes, to halt our reckless plunge into oblivion, but something held me back. A whisper of intuition that urged caution in the face of certain doom. It was then that I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by the truck's feeble beams. It was a man, tall and thin, his silhouette etched against the backdrop of the forest like an ink stain on parchment. He wore no mask, but the malevolence that radiated from him was unmistakable, palpable presence that seemed to leach the very warmth from the air. Time slowed to a crawl, each heartbeat a deafening drumbeat in my ears as I processed the impossibility of what lay before me. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch as the truck hurtled toward him, a juggernaut of metal and momentum that should have sent him scrambling for safety. But he stood his ground, his gaze fixed on us with an intensity that pierced through the fog and darkness, pinning us in place like insects on a specimen board. There was no fear in his eyes, no sign of the terror that gripped my own heart like a vice. Instead, there was a quiet confidence, a certainty that spoke of a man who knew his power and wielded it without hesitation. I knew I had seconds to react, to make a choice that would determine our fate. To stop now was to risk everything, to open ourselves up to the mercy of a predator who showed none. Yet to continue forward, charge headlong into the unknown, was to embrace uncertainty, to gamble with our lives on the razor's edge of fate. The woman's voice broke through the cacophony of thoughts, a sharp plea that cut through the fog of indecision. "Keep going," she cried, her voice a clarion call that pierced the veil of doubt and hesitation. And in that moment, something shifted within me, a resolve born of desperation, fire ignited by the need to protect and survive against all odds. I slammed my foot down on the accelerator, the engine roaring to life with a defiant snarl as the truck surged forward. Steel Leviathan determined to break free from the chains of fear. The figure remained rooted in place, his expression unchanging as the truck bore down upon him with relentless determination. And then, just as impact seemed inevitable, he stepped aside with an almost casual grace, phantom slipping through the fingers of reality itself. The world snapped back into focus, the road reappearing beneath the tires as if by some cruel sleight of hand. We sped past the spot where the figure had stood, my heart racing with a mixture of relief and disbelief at our narrow escape. Beside me, the woman let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her body sagging against the seat as the tension that had gripped her finally released its hold. "What was that?" she asked, her voice a tremor of fear and awe. I shook my head, unable to provide an answer that made any semblance of sense. The forest whispered around us, its secrets hidden beneath layers of shadow and silence, as if taunting us with the knowledge we couldn't hope to comprehend. We drove on, the road unfurling before us like a tapestry woven from dreams and nightmares, a path that led us ever deeper into the heart of darkness. The night was alive with possibility, each turn a new chapter in the story we had become unwilling participants in. And as the truck barreled forward, leaving behind the phantom of the road and the terror of what might have been, I couldn't shake the feeling that the true horror still awaited us, lurking just beyond the edge of perception, waiting to spring its trap when we least expected it. The road stretched on, a silent witness to our journey through the shadows, and I knew that whatever lay ahead, we would face it together, two souls bound by fate and the inexorable pull of the unknown. The truck thundered down the lonely highway, the engine's roar a defiant challenge against the oppressive silence of the night. I could feel the vibrations reverberating through the cab, a primal hum that seemed to match the frantic rhythm of my own racing heart. The figure we had narrowly avoided lingered in my mind, an echo of menace that refused to be silenced. The woman beside me was silent, her gaze fixed on the road ahead, as if seeking refuge from the memories that threatened to overwhelm us both. Her presence was a tangible reminder of the bond we had forged in the crucible of fear, connection that seemed to transcend the boundaries of mere circumstance. Yet, even as we hurtled through the darkness, an unspoken tension lingered between us, a specter of doubt that gnawed at the edges of my resolve. As the miles slipped away beneath the truck's tires, the landscape around us began to shift, trees thinning out to reveal a vast expanse of desolate wilderness. Fog clung to the ground like a living thing, swirling around the truck's wheels in a ghostly dance that seemed to mock our futile flight. The road stretched out before us, an endless ribbon of asphalt leading us ever deeper into the heart of the unknown. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being drawn into a trap, that the road itself was conspiring against us, luring us ever closer to some unspeakable horror that waited in the shadows. The forest loomed on either side, its twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, as if eager to snatch us from the safety of the truck and drag us into the depths of its hidden secret. Beside me, the woman shifted, her movements a restless echo of the turmoil that churned within us both. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice a fragile thread of sound that seemed to dissipate into the night. I hesitated, unsure of the answer myself. The open road held a certain allure, promise of escape from the nightmares that pursued us. But the reality of our situation was inescapable. We couldn't drive forever, couldn't outrun the shadows that clung to us with tenacious persistence. "Anywhere but here," I replied finally, my voice tinged with a desperation I couldn't quite hide. The words felt flimsy, a fragile shield against the encroaching darkness that threatened to engulf us. The woman's eyes were twin pools of uncertainty, reflecting the pale glow of the dashboard lights as they flickered like distant stars. "Do you think we're safe now?" she asked, tone a blend of hope and fear that mirrored my own tangled emotions. I glanced at her, my mind racing as I weighed the odds stacked against us. The night was vast and unyielding, a labyrinthine expanse that promised both salvation and doom. Yet in that moment, the only certainty I could offer was the flickering flame of determination that burned within me, a beacon against the encroaching shadows. "We're safer than we were back there," I said, forcing a note of conviction into my voice. It was a fragile reassurance, a slender thread of hope that seemed to stretch perilously thin across the chasm of doubt that yawned between us. But we need to keep moving. The road's the only thing keeping us out of their reach. The forest whispered its secrets as we drove on, the wind carrying with it the mournful cries of distant creatures that seemed to echo through the trees like lost souls seeking redemption. The night was alive with sound and movement, a tapestry woven from the threads of nature and the remnants of human folly. As we rounded a bend in the road, I caught sight of a small, dilapidated structure, crouching by the roadside like a wounded animal. It was a gas station, long abandoned, and forgotten by time, its skeletal remains a testament to the relentless march of decay. The sign above its entrance hung at a precarious angle, faded letters spelling out a name that had long since lost its meaning. I slowed the truck, flicker of curiosity mingling with the ever-present undercurrent of dread that thrummed through my veins. The gas station stood as a solitary sentinel in the wilderness, beacon of solitude in a world gone mad. And though I knew the risk of stopping, something about the place called to me, a whisper of familiarity that tugged at the edges of my memory. "We should keep going," the woman urged, her voice a tremor of unease that mirrored the conflict raging within me. She was right, of course. The road was our lifeline, our only means of escape from the nightmare that had ensnared us. But the pull of the gas station was undeniable, a siren's call that beckoned me with promises of answers and sanctuary. I hesitated, the decision hanging in the balance, as I weighed the potential consequences against the need for respite. The road stretched out before us, an unyielding path that seemed to promise salvation, even as it threatened to lead us further into the heart of darkness. And yet, the gas station stood as a solitary monument to the past, a relic of a time when the world had been simpler, its secrets hidden beneath layers of dust and decay. In the end, it was curiosity that won out, a gnawing need to unravel the mystery that lay hidden within the gas station's crumbling walls. I guided the truck toward the dilapidated structure, its tires crunching over the gravel-strewn lot as we pulled to a stop beneath the flickering glow of a single, dimly lit bulb. The woman watched me with wary eyes, her expression a mixture of skepticism and apprehension. "Why are we stopping here?" she asked, her voice a whisper of accusation that seemed to cut through the night like a blade. Before we dive into the second story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button to support us. This video features over an hour of spine-chilling content curated just for you. I'm thrilled you're here to experience these terrifying tales with us. Your support means everything. Now, let's get into the second story. I've been behind the wheel of a big rig for more than 2 decades now. You get used to the long hauls, the lonely nights, and the endless miles of open road. But there's a darkness that comes with this job too, a kind of shadow that clings to you after you've seen enough. I've encountered my fair share of strange and downright terrifying things out there. Nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for that one night. It started like any other night. The sky was a dark, angry gray, and the wind howled through the trees lining the highway. I had a load of goods to deliver, and a tight schedule to keep. The rain started as a light drizzle but quickly turned into a torrential downpour, the kind where your wipers are useless and every flash of lightning makes the world look like a strobe-lit horror show. Despite the storm, I kept pushing forward. I've driven through worse, or so I thought. I remembered glancing at the clock on my dashboard. It was just past midnight, the witching hour, some folks call it. A time when the world feels just a bit thinner, like something might reach through from the other side. The rain was relentless, pounding against my windshield with a fury that matched my growing sense of unease. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. The hum of the engine was a comforting sound, constant in the chaos outside. But there was something else, something that gnawed at the edges of my mind, feeling that I couldn't quite shake. And then I saw them. Standing on the shoulder of the road, illuminated by the harsh glare of my headlights. A woman, soaked to the bone, holding a small child wrapped in a tattered blanket. They were huddled together, shivering, looking like they'd stepped out of a nightmare. I had a split second to decide. The truck slowed almost on its own, my foot easing off the gas as I pulled over. I've always been a cautious man, but something about the sight of that child made my heart ache. I couldn't just leave them out there in the storm. I rolled down my window and called out to the woman. Her face was a mask of desperation and relief as she hurried over, the child clinging to her like a lifeline. I told myself I was doing the right thing, that anyone with a heart would do the same. But deep down, a sliver of doubt had already taken root. And as they climbed into my truck, bringing the cold and wet with them, I couldn't help but feel like I'd just opened the door to something far more sinister than the storm outside. The woman and child huddled together in the passenger seat, shivering and drenched. Cab's dim interior lights cast eerie shadows on their faces, making the scene even more unsettling. I handed the woman an old blanket I kept behind the seat and tried to make small talk as I got back on the road. Her name was Lisa, and her little boy was Timmy. She said their car had broken down a few miles back, and they'd been trying to hitch a ride for hours. Her voice was shaky, and her eyes darted around like a cornered animal. As we drove, the rain continued to lash against the windshield, the rhythmic drumming almost hypnotic. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Lisa's story kept changing. First, they were headed to her sister's place in the next town, then it was her mother's house a few counties over. I tried to brush it off as nerves, but the pit in my stomach only grew deeper. Timmy hadn't said a word. He just stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes, seemed too old for his small face. There was something unsettling about his silence, something that set my nerves on edge. I glanced at Lisa and noticed she kept fidgeting with her bag, clutching it like a lifeline. Every time I asked about their plans, she would deflect or give vague answers, her grip on the bag tightening. The storm outside was nothing compared to the growing tempest inside the truck. My heart raced with a mix of fear and suspicion. I couldn't afford to be careless, not with so many horror stories of roadside encounters gone wrong. I needed to know what was in that bag. And Lisa wasn't looking. I craned my neck just enough to peek inside. My breath caught in my throat. Nestled among the clothes and miscellaneous items was the unmistakable handle of a knife. Panic surged through me, icy and paralyzing. I kept my face as neutral as possible, but inside, I was screaming. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios, and every instinct screamed at me to get them out of my truck. But I had to be smart about it. One wrong move and things could go south fast. I needed a plan, a way to get them out without raising suspicion. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to speak calmly. Hey, I've been driving for hours. I need to hit a rest stop and use the bathroom. You and Timmy can stretch your legs for a bit. Lisa's eyes narrowed for a split second before she forced a smile. Sure, that sounds good. Timmy could use a break. My heart pounded as I pulled into the rest area, the neon lights flickering like a warning. I parked near the restrooms and got out, pretending to stretch. I'll be right back, I said, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my insides. As I walked towards the restrooms, I kept my eyes on the truck, praying she wouldn't follow. Once inside, I made a beeline for the payphone, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. The operator's calm voice was a stark contrast to my panicked whisper. There's a woman in my truck, I said, glancing over my shoulder. She has a knife. I think she's dangerous. Please send help. The operator assured me that officers were on their way, but every second felt like an eternity. I hung up and took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. All I had to do now was wait, but the fear gnawed at me, relentless and unforgiving. I walked back to the truck, every step heavy with dread. Lisa watched me from the passenger seat, eyes glinting in the dim light. Timmy still hadn't said a word. His small frame huddled close to her. I forced a smile, trying to mask the anxiety that churned inside me. Everything okay? She asked, her voice tinged with something that sounded almost like suspicion. Yeah, I replied, keeping my tone casual. Just needed to stretch my legs a bit. Long drives, you know? Climbed back into the driver's seat, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. Engine roared to life, and we were back on the road, the storm raging outside, mirroring the turmoil within me. I stole glances at Lisa, her gaze fixed on the road ahead, fingers tapping a nervous rhythm on the armrest. I could feel the tension thick in the air, like a coiled spring ready to snap. My mind raced, trying to figure out the best course of action. The police were on their way, but until they arrived, I was trapped in this rolling nightmare. Every mile we covered felt like a step deeper into the unknown. I tried to keep the conversation light, asking about Timmy's school and Lisa's family. Her answers were curt, focus elsewhere. As we drove, I began to notice things I hadn't before. The way Timmy clung to his mother, his eyes darting around nervously, as if expecting something terrible to happen. The way Lisa's hands shook when she thought I wasn't looking. There was a story here, buried beneath the surface, and I wasn't sure I wanted to uncover it. Then, out of nowhere, Timmy spoke. His voice was small and tremulous, barely audible over the storm. "Mommy, I'm scared." Lisa's face softened, and for a moment I saw a flicker of genuine emotion. "It's okay, baby. We're safe now." But there was something in her eyes, a shadow of doubt, made my blood run cold. I knew I had to keep them calm, keep the situation from escalating. "Hey, Timmy," I said, trying to sound cheerful. "You like stories? I used to tell my kids all kinds of stories when they were your age." Timmy nodded, small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, I like stories." Lisa shot me a wary glance, but said nothing. I took a deep breath and started telling a simple, harmless story about a brave knight and a dragon, hoping to distract them both, if only for a little while. But even as I spoke, my mind was racing, trying to think of a way to get through this without anyone getting hurt. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. The road stretched out before us, a dark ribbon winding through the storm. I kept my eyes on the horizon, looking for any sign of the police. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a countdown to the unknown. And then, in the distance, I saw them, flashing lights cutting through the darkness, growing brighter with each passing second. Relief washed over me, mingled with a fresh wave of fear. This wasn't over yet. I had to play it cool, act like everything was normal, until the police were close enough to intervene. "Looks like we're coming up on a checkpoint," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Probably just a routine stop because of the storm." Lisa's eyes narrowed, but she nodded. "Yeah, probably." As we approached the flashing lights, I prayed silently that everything would go smoothly, that this nightmare would end without anyone getting hurt. The truck slowed to a crawl, the lights illuminating the cab in a strobe-like fashion. I could see the officers ahead, their silhouettes stark against the storm. This was it, the moment of truth. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my trembling hands. Whatever happened next, I had to stay calm. For Timmy, for myself, and for whatever shred of sanity I had left. Flashing lights grew brighter, and the shapes of the officers became clearer through the downpour. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. I glanced at Lisa, trying to gauge her reaction. Her eyes were locked on the approaching officers, her jaw clenched. She knew something was off. I had to be careful. The truck rolled to a stop, and one of the officers approached my window. He tapped on the glass, and I lowered it, rain immediately pelting my face. "Evening, officer," I said, forcing a casual tone. "Bad night to be out, huh?" The officer nodded, his eyes flicking to Lisa and Timmy. "Yeah, it's a rough one. Mind stepping out of the vehicle for a moment? Just a routine check." I nodded, trying to keep my movements slow and deliberate. "Sure thing." I glanced at Lisa, who was watching me with a mix of fear and suspicion. "I'll be right back." Stepping out into the storm, I felt the cold rain soak through my clothes instantly. The officer led me a few steps away from the truck, his face serious. "We got your call," said quietly. "What's the situation?" I took a deep breath, the words tumbling out in a rush. "The woman in my truck, she's got a knife. I think she's dangerous. The kid seems scared of her too." The officer nodded, his expression grim. "We've got backup on the way. Just stay calm and follow our lead." I nodded, my stomach churning with anxiety. As the officer walked back towards the truck, I saw Lisa's eyes narrow, her suspicion turning to panic. She knew something was up. She reached for her bag, her movements quick and jerky. "No sudden moves," the officer said, hand resting on his holstered weapon. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Lisa's eyes darted between the officer and me, her breathing quick and shallow. "What's going on? Why are you doing this?" "Just a routine check, ma'am." The officer replied, his voice calm but firm. "Please step out of the vehicle." Timmy started to cry, his small frame shaking with sobs. "Mommy, what's happening?" Lisa's face twisted with a mix of fear and anger. "It's okay, baby. Everything's going to be okay." She reached for the door handle, her other hand still clutching the bag. I held my breath, praying that she wouldn't do anything rash. Tension was palpable, a taut wire ready to snap. The officer took a step closer, his hand tightening on his weapon. "Ma'am, I need you to step out of the vehicle now." With a shaky breath, Lisa opened the door and stepped out, still holding the bag. The officer immediately moved to take the bag from her, but she pulled back, her eyes wild. "No, you can't take this." "Ma'am, please cooperate," the officer said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Lisa looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of betrayal and desperation. "You called them, didn't you? You don't understand. I had to do it. He was gonna hurt us." Before I could process her words, the backup arrived. More officers surrounded the truck, their presence a wall of authority and reassurance. They carefully took the bag from Lisa, revealing the knife and other items inside. As they restrained her, Lisa's protests turned to sobs. "You don't understand. He was going to kill us." Timmy's cries grew louder. One of the officers gently took him aside, trying to comfort him. I stood there, drenched and shaken, my mind reeling from the chaos of the last few minutes. The realization hit me hard. This wasn't just a random encounter. There was a story here, one I might never fully understand. As the police led Lisa away, I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. The storms still raged around us, but the immediate danger had passed. I walked back to the truck, my legs feeling like lead. I glanced at Timmy, tear-streaked face, a haunting reminder of the night's events. I climbed back into the driver's seat, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. The rain continued to pound against the windshield, but the storm inside me was far from over. I had survived the encounter, but the darkness that had touched my life that night would linger long after the skies had cleared. As the police took Lisa away, her screams of desperation echoed in my mind. "You don't understand. He was going to kill us." Those words rattled around my head like a ghostly chant, refusing to be silenced. I climbed back into the truck, the warmth of the cab doing little to thaw the icy dread that had settled in my bones. Timmy was still crying, heart-wrenching sound that pierced through the storm's fury. I wanted to comfort him, tell him everything would be okay, but how could I when I wasn't even sure myself? I glanced at him, his small body trembling with fear. "Hey, buddy," I said softly. "It's gonna be all right. The police are here to help." His wide, tear-filled eyes looked up at me, and for a moment, I saw the depth of his terror. Not just from the storm or the police, something deeper, something that had been haunting him long before this night. Felt a pang of helplessness, realizing that whatever trauma they were running from was far from over. The officers approached, their faces grim but resolute. One of them, a tall man with a kind face, leaned into the cab. "We need to ask you a few questions," he said gently. "Can you come with us?" I nodded, glancing at Timmy. "What about the boy?" "We'll take care of him," the officer assured me. "He's safe now." Safe. The word felt hollow given the night's events, but I followed the officer, leaving the warmth of the cab and stepping back into the cold, wet night. They led me to a patrol car, where I was given a blanket and a hot cup of coffee. Questions came in a steady stream. What had happened? What Lisa had said? Why I'd picked them up. I answered as best I could, my mind still reeling from the shock. As I spoke, pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. Lisa's erratic behavior, her desperate need to keep moving, the way she clutched that knife as if her life depended on it. She wasn't just a criminal. She was a woman on the run, and the true danger might have been behind her all along. The officers exchanged looks, their faces etched with concern. "We're going to investigate her story," one of them said. "But right now, we need to make sure you're okay." I nodded, grateful for their concern, still haunted by the night's events. They offered to drive me to a nearby motel, somewhere I could get some rest and wait for the storm to pass. I accepted, too exhausted to argue. As we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that the darkness that had touched my life tonight was just a glimpse of something much larger. The motel was a dingy place, the kind that made you feel more alone, despite its attempt at hospitality. The officer handed me a key, his eyes filled with sympathy. "Try to get some rest," he said. "We'll keep you updated." Sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Lisa's terrified face, heard Timmy's cries. The storm outside was a constant reminder of the chaos that had unfolded. I tossed and turned, my mind a battlefield of fear and doubt. Hours passed, and I must have dozed off at some point because I awoke to the sound of my phone ringing. Groggy and disoriented, I answered it. It was one of the officers. "We've been looking into Lisa's story," he said. Turns out, she was telling the truth. Her ex-husband is a dangerous man. She was running to protect her son. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I sat up, the room spinning around me. "What happens now?" I managed to ask. "We've got them both in protective custody," the officer replied. "They're safe for now, thanks to you." Safe. The word held more weight now. I hung up the phone and sat there in the silence, the storm outside finally starting to abate. I had done the right thing, but the night had left its mark on me. The darkness had touched my life, and I knew it would be a long time before I could drive through a storm without looking over my shoulder. The storm had passed, but the lingering dread it left behind clung to me like a second skin. The sun was starting to rise, casting long shadows across the parking lot of the motel. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold morning air. The officer's words echoed in my mind. Lisa and Timmy were safe, but their safety came at the cost of my peace of mind. I packed my things, moving like a man in a daze. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside the window made me jump. Couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, lurking just beyond the edges of my perception. I knew I had to get back on the road, back to the routine that had been my life for so long. But how could I drive those lonely highways without thinking of the terror that had shared my cab? I checked out of the motel, the receptionist barely glancing up as she took the key. Outside, my truck sat waiting, a silent sentinel. The thought of getting back in, of driving through the places where shadows seemed to stretch longer, was almost too much to bear. But I had to keep moving. I had deliveries to make, a life to return to. Climbing into the cab, I felt a wave of nausea. The seat where Lisa had sat, where Timmy had clung to her, was a stark reminder of the night's events. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. The engine roared to life, a sound that used to bring me comfort, but now seemed almost menacing. As I pulled out onto the highway, the landscape was bathed in the pale light of dawn. The world looked deceptively normal, as if it hadn't just been touched by a nightmare. I drove in silence, the hum of the engine the only sound. My mind kept drifting back to Lisa's words, her desperate plea for understanding. "You don't understand. He was going to kill us." Miles rolled by, but the unease never left me. I stopped at a diner for breakfast, hoping a hot meal and a break from the road would calm my nerves. The place was nearly empty. Few patrons scattered at tables like ghosts. I ordered coffee and eggs, trying to focus on the mundane act of eating. But every clatter of dishes, every murmur of conversation, seemed to carry an undercurrent of menace. I finished my meal and paid the bill, leaving a generous tip out of some misplaced sense of guilt. Back on the road, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see Lisa's ex-husband following me, his face a mask of rage. But the highway remained empty, stretching out before me like a promise and a threat. Hours passed, and the landscape changed from rolling hills to dense forests. Trees crowded the road, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The sense of being watched grew stronger. Paranoia that settled deep in my bones. I told myself it was just the aftermath of a harrowing night, that I was safe now. But the feeling wouldn't go away. I decided to pull over at a rest stop, needing a break from the oppressive atmosphere of the cab. Stepping out, I took a deep breath, cool air filling my lungs. The rest stop was deserted, the silence almost deafening. I walked to a bench and sat down, trying to collect my thoughts. The events of the night felt like a twisted dream, but the fear was all too real. Suddenly, I heard a noise, faint rustling coming from the woods. My heart skipped a beat, the paranoia flaring up again. I stood up, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. Just the wind, I told myself. But the feeling of being watched persisted. I got back into the truck, locking the doors behind me. As I sat there, trying to calm my racing heart, I realized that this fear, this constant sense of dread, might never leave me. The darkness I had glimpsed that night was now a part of me, a shadow that would follow me wherever I went. I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, determined to keep moving. But as the miles stretched out before me, I knew that I would always be looking over my shoulder, haunted by the memory of a stormy night and the terror that came with it. Days turned into weeks, and life on the road resumed its monotonous rhythm. But the encounter with Lisa and Timmy had left a permanent scar on my psyche. Constant hum of the engine, the familiar rotes, even the solitude that I once cherished, all felt tainted. The shadows of that stormy night clung to me, whispering their dark secrets in my ear. Sleep became a battleground. Each night, I would lie in my bunk, the confines of the truck cab pressing in around me. When sleep finally came, it brought with it vivid nightmares. I would find myself back on that rain-soaked highway, Lisa and Timmy staring at me with hollow eyes, their faces twisted in fear. Sometimes, I would dream of the ex-husband, faceless figure emerging from the darkness, presence a cold, palpable terror. One night, I awoke with a start, my heart hammering in my chest. The dream had been particularly vivid. Lisa's desperate cries still echoed in my ears, and the feeling of being watched lingered long after I had opened my eyes. I sat up, cab bathed in the soft glow of the truck stop lights. The rain pattered against the roof, a haunting reminder of that night. I needed to get out, to shake off the lingering fear. I slipped on my boots and stepped out into the cool night air. The truck stop was nearly deserted, the distant hum of other engines the only sound. I walked towards the convenience store, hoping a cup of coffee might help clear my mind. As I approached, I noticed a figure standing near the entrance, partially hidden in the shadows. My heart skipped a beat, my mind immediately jumping to the worst-case scenario. But as I got closer, I realized it was just another trucker, a weary man with a haunted look in his eye. He gave me a nod as I passed, a silent acknowledgement of shared burdens. Inside, the fluorescent lights cast a harsh glare on the rows of snacks and drinks. I grabbed a cup of coffee, the warmth a small comfort against the chill that had settled in my bones. I stood by the window, staring out at the rain-soaked pavement, my thoughts drifting back to Lisa and Timmy. Were they truly safe? Had the police been able to protect them from whatever horrors they were running from? As I sipped my coffee, I felt a presence beside me. I turned to see the same trucker, his face etched with lines of fatigue and worry. "Rough night?" he asked, voice a gravelly whisper. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He seemed to understand, his eyes reflecting a deep, unspoken sorrow. "We all have our demons," said quietly. "Sometimes they catch up to us, no matter how fast we drive." His words struck a chord, a grim reminder of the truth I was trying to escape. I finished my coffee and nodded in thanks, then headed back to my truck. The rain had stopped, leaving the air crisp and clean. Climbed into the cab, familiar scent of diesel and worn leather, a small comfort. As I settled into my bunk, I resolved to keep moving, to outrun the darkness that seemed to follow me. But deep down, I knew it was a futile effort. The shadows of that night would always be with me, a constant reminder of the fragility of safety and the ever-present danger lurking just out of sight. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, the nightmares returned. I found myself back on the highway, the storm raging around me. Lisa and Timmy stood by the roadside, their eyes pleading for help. I tried to reach them, but the road stretched endlessly before me, an insurmountable barrier. The faceless figure of the ex-husband loomed closer, his presence a chilling promise of violence. I awoke with a start, my body drenched in sweat. The dawn was breaking, first light of day creeping over the horizon. I knew I couldn't stay still, couldn't let the fear consume me. I had to keep driving, keep pushing forward, even if it meant carrying the weight of that night with me. The engine roared to life, and I pulled onto the highway, the world bathed in the soft hues of morning. The road stretched out before me, path through the unknown. I drove on, the memories of that stormy night a constant companion, a reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the edge of the light. Weeks passed, and the endless miles of highway became my sanctuary and my prison. I was constantly on the move, trying to escape the memories that clung to me like a dark shroud. But no matter how far I drove, the specter of that night was never far behind. Followed me through rain-soaked highways, lonely truck stops, and the endless stretch of empty road that seemed to have no end. One evening, I found myself parked at a secluded rest area, the sun setting behind a thick veil of clouds. Air was heavy, prelude to another storm. I sat in the cab staring out at the darkening sky, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on me. The radio played softly in the background, a static-filled country song that did little to lift my spirits. As the first drops of rain began to fall, I heard a knock on my window. My heart leaped into my throat, fear gripping me tightly. I turned slowly, half expecting to see a familiar, haunted face. Instead, it was another trucker, his face illuminated by the dim glow of my interior lights. He gestured for me to roll down the window. Cautiously, I did so, the rain spattering my arm. "What's up?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "You got a CB radio?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. I nodded, pointing to the device mounted on the dashboard. "Yeah, why? Mind if I use it for a second? My rig's radio is busted, and I need to get a message out." I hesitated, but the desperation in his eyes was all too familiar. "Sure," I said, motioning for him to come around to the passenger side. He climbed in, dripping water onto the floor, and reached for the radio. As he adjusted the dials, a crackling voice came through, and I caught fragments of a conversation. "Weather's getting worse, be careful out there." The trucker spoke into the microphone, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "This is Big Red. If anyone can hear me, I need to get a message to a friend. Over." The response was immediate, distorted voice crackling through the static. "Big Red, this is Blue Eagle. What's the message? Over." "I need to warn him," Big Red said, his eyes flicking to me briefly. "There's a storm coming, and it's bringing more than just rain." "Info." I felt a chill run down my spine at his words. There was something in his tone, something that hinted at a deeper, darker meaning. He handed the microphone back to me, a look of gratitude on his face. "Thanks," he said quietly. "Just needed to make sure he stays safe." "No problem," I replied, though my mind was racing with questions. "Who were you warning?" "Friend," he said, his voice distant. "He's on the same route as you, and he's been through some rough times, just like you." Before I could ask anything else, he climbed out of the cab and disappeared into the night, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The rain was coming down harder now, a relentless downpour that mirrored the turmoil inside me. I sat there, staring at the empty seat, echoes of his words lingering in the air. "There's a storm coming, and it's bringing more than just rain." The message was clear, a warning that resonated deep within me. The darkness that had haunted me since that fateful night was not just a memory. It was a living, breathing entity, a shadow that threatened to consume me if I let my guard down. I knew then that the road ahead was fraught with danger, not just from the elements, but from the unseen forces that lurked in the corners of my mind. I started the engine, the roar of the truck a reassuring sound in the midst of the storm. As I pulled onto the highway, the rain pounded against the windshield, a relentless reminder of the battle I was fighting. But this time, I felt a spark of determination ignite within me. I wasn't just running from the darkness, I was facing it head-on, ready to confront whatever horrors lay in wait. The miles stretched out before me, a winding path through the unknown. With each turn of the wheel, I felt the weight of fear lift, replaced by a steely resolve. I would keep driving, keep moving forward, no matter what. The darkness might follow me, but it would never catch me, not if I had anything to say about it. As the storm raged around me, I drove on, the headlights cutting through the night. The road was long and treacherous, but I was ready to face the shadows, confront the demons that haunted me, and to find the light that lay just beyond the horizon. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed these chilling stories as much as I enjoyed bringing them to you. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel and give us a thumbs up to keep the terror coming. Your support means the world to us and helps us bring more spine-tingling content your way. Before you go, don't forget to check out the video playing on the screen. It's packed with more unsettling tales and eerie experiences that you won't want to miss. If you have any frightening stories of your own or suggestions for future content, drop them in the comments below. Stay tuned for more haunting adventures. Until next time, sleep tight, if you can.